In the 1980s, governments literally hired people whose only job was to watch movies and decide which ones you weren't allowed to see. Britain's video nasties list banned 72 films in a single sweep. Australia, Germany, and even Canada followed with their own blacklists. The wildest part? Most of these so-called dangerous films are now streaming on your phone. Here are 15 banned 80s cult classics you can watch tonight. Number 15, Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. This is the film so realistic that the director got arrested because authorities genuinely believed he had killed his actors on camera. Ruggero Deodato had to bring his cast into an Italian courtroom alive and well just to prove he hadn't committed murder. That is not a marketing gimmick. That actually happened. Cannibal Holocaust was banned in over 50 countries, making it one of the most prohibited motion pictures in cinema history. The Italian government seized every print they could find within 10 days of its release, and Deodato faced obscenity charges that took years to resolve. The film presents itself as recovered documentary footage from a crew that vanished in the Amazon rainforest, and it pioneered the found footage format decades before the Blair Witch Project made it trendy. The violence is extreme, and the practical effects are disturbingly convincing, which is exactly why authorities couldn't tell what was real. Riz Ortolani's haunting score plays against the brutality in a way that critics now call one of the most effective uses of contrast in horror filmmaking. The British Board of Film Classification kept this one off shelves for nearly 2 decades. Deodato himself has said the film was meant as a savage critique of Western media sensationalism, pointing the camera back at audiences who consume violence as entertainment. Love it or despise it, this is where modern found footage horror was born, and it paid an enormous legal price for being ahead of its time. It streams on Shudder and Tubi in various cuts depending on your region. Number 14, The Evil Dead, 1981. Sam Raimi made this movie for roughly $350,000 with his college buddies in a cabin in Tennessee, and it ended up getting slapped with bans across the United Kingdom during the video nasties panic. The British Director of Public Prosecutions placed it on the official list of prohibited videotapes in 1983, and distributors who stocked it risked prosecution and jail time. 5 friends go to a remote cabin in the woods. They find a mysterious book and a tape recorder. They play the recording. Then everything goes horrifically wrong. The premise sounds simple because it is, but Raimi's relentless camera work turned a shoestring budget into pure kinetic terror that studio horror films costing 20 times more couldn't match. Bruce Campbell's performance as Ash Williams became so iconic that it launched an entire franchise spanning 4 decades, multiple sequels, a television series, and video games. Stephen King himself called The Evil Dead the most ferociously original horror film of the year, and that endorsement helped Raimi secure funding for the sequel. The production was legendarily brutal on the cast. Campbell was beaten, bloodied, and covered in corn syrup for weeks on end, while shooting in genuinely freezing conditions with no running water. The tree scene alone triggered the censorship firestorm in Britain, and even Raimi later admitted he wished he had handled that sequence differently. Despite the bans, underground VHS copies spread like wildfire across Europe, turning The Evil Dead into a grassroots phenomenon. It was eventually removed from the banned list in 1985 and passed uncut by the BBFC in 2001. You can stream it right now on multiple platforms and witness firsthand why a cabin in the Tennessee woods changed horror forever. Number 13, Faces of Death, 1978. Technically released in 1978, but achieving its peak notoriety and bannings throughout the early 1980s. Faces of Death became the ultimate forbidden videotape of the VHS era. This was the movie kids whispered about on the playground, the one older siblings claimed they'd seen, the tape that supposedly showed real footage of people dying on camera. It was banned in over 40 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, and multiple European nations. The truth behind Faces of Death is almost more fascinating than the film itself. Director John Alan Schwartz has openly admitted that the vast majority of the most shocking sequences were entirely fabricated using actors and special effects. The infamous alligator scene, the restaurant scene, and several other marquee moments were all staged. But the filmmakers deliberately blurred the line between real documentary footage and manufactured horror, creating an experience that audiences genuinely could not decipher. This ambiguity is what terrified censors. The film grossed over $35 million on a production budget of under $500,000, making it one of the most profitable independent films of its decade. It spawned multiple sequels and countless imitators that tried to replicate its shock value without understanding what made the original so unsettling. The real genius of Faces of Death was never the content itself, but the question it forced audiences to ask themselves about why they wanted to watch it in the first place. Critics at the time dismissed it as garbage, but modern horror scholars revisit it as an essential text on audience psychology and the commodification of death in media. It streams on Tubi for free. Number 12, I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Another late 70s release that earned its most aggressive bans and its cult following squarely in the 1980s home video boom. Director Mira Zarchi has stated he was inspired to make this film after personally helping a real assault victim he encountered in a park, and his frustration with the justice system's failure drove him to create a revenge fantasy that remains one of the most debated films in horror history. When it first played theatrically, Roger Ebert gave it 0 stars and called it one of the worst films ever made. He walked out of the screening furious. But here is what makes the conversation complicated. Feminist critics in the decades since have re-examined the film and argued that it functions as a brutal, unflinching depiction of violence against women, followed by a cathartic and empowering reversal where the victim systematically destroys her attackers. The film was banned outright in Ireland, Norway, Iceland, and West Germany, and it was prosecuted as a video nasty in the United Kingdom. Zarchi financed the original production himself for roughly $325,000. It earned over $5 million domestically, despite playing in limited grindhouse theaters and drive-ins. The 2010 remake proved the concept still had commercial power. Whether you view this film as exploitation or empowerment depends entirely on which critical lens you bring to it, and that unresolvable tension is precisely why it endures. It never lets you feel comfortable. It never lets you look away clean. It never gives you an easy answer. Streaming availability varies by region. It can be found on major platforms including Amazon Prime. Number 11, The Driller Killer, 1979. Abel Ferrara's grimy lo-fi debut feature, it hit UK shelves in the early 1980s with VHS cover art, so provocative that it became one of the primary catalysts for the entire video nasties moral panic. The cover showed a drill bit piercing through a man's forehead, and conservative campaigner Mary Whitehouse reportedly used that image specifically when lobbying Parliament to crack down on home video content. The irony is that The Driller Killer is far more of an art film than its reputation suggests. Ferrara stars as Reno Miller, a struggling New York painter slowly losing his grip on sanity while living in a squalid apartment above a relentlessly loud punk band. The city itself becomes a character. Late 70s New York in all its crumbling, dangerous, magnificent decay is captured with an authenticity that documentary filmmakers would envy. The violence, when it arrives, is sudden and ugly, but the film spends most of its running time building psychological dread through Reno's deteriorating mental state, his financial desperation, and the relentless sensory assault of urban living. Ferrara went on to direct King of New York, Bad Lieutenant, and other critically respected films. But The Driller Killer remains the one that almost ended his career before it started. The British ban lasted years, and the film only received an uncut UK release in 2002. Modern critics have largely reappraised it as a genuine portrait of artistic frustration and urban alienation dressed in horror clothing. You can find it streaming and finally see for yourself that the movie behind the most notorious VHS cover of the decade is actually a thoughtful, angry, deeply personal piece of independent cinema. Number 10, Basket Case, 1982. Frank Henenlotter shot this film for roughly $35,000 on the streets of Times Square back when Times Square was still one of the sleaziest blocks in America. And the result is a creature feature unlike anything you have seen before or since. A young man named Dwayne Bradley walks into a Fleabag, New York hotel carrying a large wicker basket. Inside that basket is his formerly conjoined twin brother, Belial, a lumpy, deformed, telepathically connected mass of rage and flesh who was surgically separated against their will. Together, they are hunting down the doctors responsible. The premise alone tells you this is not a normal movie. Henenlotter used stop-motion animation and a combination of puppetry techniques to bring Belial to life, and the results are simultaneously ridiculous and oddly affecting. You actually start to feel something for this angry little creature. The film was banned in the UK under the Video Nasties Act, which is almost comical given how much dark humor runs through every frame. Henenlotter never intended pure horror. He wanted to make a grindhouse comedy about brotherly love, taken to its most grotesque extreme. It became a massive underground hit in New York's 42nd Street theaters and on home video internationally. Basket Case earned enough to spawn 2 sequels and cement Henenlotter as a godfather of midnight movie culture. Critics who dismissed it in 1982 now recognize its handmade charm and genuine emotional core. You can stream it on several platforms and discover why a wicker basket became one of the most iconic props in horror history. Number 9, Videodrome, 1983. David Cronenberg predicted the internet, media addiction, reality television, and deepfakes in 1983, and nobody listened because they were too busy being horrified. James Woods stars as Max Wren, the president of a sleazy cable station who stumbles onto a mysterious broadcast signal called Videodrome that appears to show real torture and violence. As he becomes obsessed with the signal, the boundaries between his body, his television, and his hallucinations begin collapsing. The film was heavily censored in multiple countries and outright banned in some regions due to its unflinching body horror imagery, courtesy of the legendary Rick Baker's groundbreaking practical effects. Cronenberg's thesis that technology would eventually merge with human flesh and reshape our perception of reality seemed outrageous in 1983. Now it reads like prophecy. The famous line, "Long live the new flesh," has been quoted in academic papers about virtual reality, transhumanism, and digital identity. Debbie Harry of Blondie delivers a mesmerizing performance as Wren's equally obsessed partner, and her presence brought an entirely different audience to what would otherwise have been a niche body horror film. Videodrome was a box office disappointment on initial release, earning under $2 million domestically, but its reputation has grown every single year since. The Criterion Collection gave it a definitive release, essentially canonizing it as high art. What was once considered too disturbing for mainstream audiences is now taught in film schools worldwide as a masterclass in prophetic science fiction, filmmaking. Stream it, and realize that Cronenberg was warning us about the world we are living in right now. Number 8, Possession, 1981. Andrzej Zulawski's Possession might be the most unhinged breakup movie ever committed to film. Isabelle Adjani and Sam Neill play a married couple whose relationship disintegrates with such ferocity that it literally manifests a tentacled creature in a Berlin apartment. Adjani's performance in the subway scene is frequently cited as one of the greatest single scenes of physical acting in cinema history. She reportedly prepared for months, pushed herself to a psychological and physical extreme, and afterwards said it took her years to fully recover from making this film. She won Best Actress at Cannes for this role. The film was banned outright in the UK under the Video Nasties designation, and in the United States, the distributor released a butchered version that removed nearly 40 minutes of footage and tried to reframe it as a straightforward horror movie, destroying Zulawski's vision entirely. The uncut version is a swirling, operatic nightmare about love, obsession, identity, and Cold War paranoia set against the backdrop of a divided Berlin. The wall itself becomes a metaphor for the psychological partition between two people who once shared everything. Carlo Rambaldi, who created the creatures for Alien and later E.T., designed the entity in this film, and his work here is arguably his most disturbing creation. Zulawski drew on his own devastating divorce as raw material, and that autobiographical anguish bleeds through every frame. Modern audiences have rediscovered Possession as a genuinely great film rather than just a cult curiosity. It is streaming and waiting for you to experience what might be the most emotionally devastating horror film ever made. Number 7, Reanimator, 1985. Stuart Gordon took H.P. Lovecraft's story, Herbert West Reanimator, and turned it into one of the most wildly entertaining horror comedies of the entire decade, and censors across the globe absolutely lost their minds over it. Jeffrey Combs delivers a career-defining performance as Herbert West, a brilliant, arrogant, deeply unstable medical student who has developed a glowing green reagent that can bring the dead back to life. The results are messy. The film was initially given an X rating in the United States, which in the mid-80s essentially meant commercial death, and it was banned or heavily cut in several countries including the UK and Germany. Gordon released it unrated theatrically to avoid the stigma, and it became a massive hit on the midnight movie circuit and home video. The practical effects by a team including John Nolan are outrageously inventive and gleefully excessive. There is a sequence involving a reanimated head that remains one of the most audacious scenes in horror comedy history. Combs' deadpan delivery of increasingly insane dialogue gives the film its secret weapon. He plays Herbert West with absolute sincerity, which makes every absurd escalation funnier and more disturbing simultaneously. The film spawned 2 sequels and a recent television adaptation announcement, proving the material's enduring appeal. Critics who initially dismissed it as tasteless schlock gradually came around, and it now holds an extremely strong approval rating among horror fans and mainstream critics alike. Reanimator proved that Lovecraft adaptations could be faithful in spirit, while being wildly original in execution. Stream it and watch Jeffrey Combs inject so much charisma into a role that he essentially became horror royalty overnight. Number 6, Tenebrae, 1982. Dario Argento was already the undisputed master of the giallo genre when he made Tenebrae, but this film pushed his obsession with stylized violence so far that it got banned in the UK and heavily censored across Europe. The premise is deliciously meta. An American horror novelist visits Rome to promote his latest book, and someone begins murdering people using his fiction as a blueprint. Argento essentially made a film about the moral panic surrounding violent art, while simultaneously creating the most violently stylish film of his career. The legendary 2.5-minute crane shot that travels up the exterior of an apartment building, glides across the roof, and descends on the other side to witness a murder through a window is one of the most technically ambitious single shots in horror cinema. Cinematographer Luciano Tovoli engineered it with a custom rig, and it reportedly took an entire day to get right. The film's axe murder scene unleashed such a fountain of stage blood that the British censors singled it out specifically as grounds for prosecution under the Video Nasties Act. Goblin collaborator and frequent Argento partner Claudio Simonetti provided an electronic score that pulses through the film like a second heartbeat. Argento has called Tenebrae one of his personal favorites among his own work, and many fans consider it his tightest, most narratively satisfying film. The plot twists actually hold together, which is not something you can always say about giallo. It streams in its uncut glory now, decades after censors tried to bury it. If you have never experienced Argento at his peak, this is where you start. Number 5, The House by the Cemetery, 1981. Lucio Fulci was Dario Argento's great rival in Italian horror, and The House by the Cemetery represents Fulci at his most atmospheric and most gruesome in equal measure. A family moves into a New England home with a dark history connected to a doctor named Freudstein, who conducted unspeakable experiments in the basement. The film was a core title on the UK's Video Nasties list and was prosecuted for obscenity. Fulci's approach to horror was always more visceral and dreamlike than Argento's. Where Argento composed elaborate visual puzzles, Fulci went for the gut, literally. Gore effects by Gianetto de Rossi are extraordinary and stomach-turning, featuring some of the most memorable practical work of the decade. But what elevates The House by the Cemetery above mere shock value is Fulci's genuine ability to create dread through pacing, set design, and sound. The basement of that house feels like a living thing. Walter Rizzati's score adds a layer of gothic melancholy that gives the film an unexpectedly emotional undercurrent. The child actor's dubbing has been criticized for decades, and honestly, the voice work is bizarre. But some fans argue it actually adds to the film's surreal, nightmarish quality. Fulci was furious about the censorship, particularly in Britain, and spent years defending his work as legitimate artistic expression. He never received the mainstream critical respect he deserved during his lifetime, but modern horror culture has elevated him to his rightful place alongside Argento and Bava. Stream this one late at night with the lights off, and you will understand why Fulci earned the nickname the Godfather of Gore. Number 4, The New York Ripper, 1982. Speaking of Lucio Fulci, here is his most controversial film by a considerable margin. The New York Ripper was not just banned in the United Kingdom, it was physically seized by customs at the border and destroyed. The British censors did not just reject it, they treated the prints themselves as contraband. The film follows a detective tracking a vicious killer through early 80s New York, and the killer communicates in a bizarre, quacking duck voice that sounds absurd on paper, but plays as genuinely unsettling in context. Fulci shot on location in the grimiest corners of Manhattan during a period when the city was at its most dangerous and decayed, and the result is a time capsule of a New York that no longer exists. The violence against women in the film drew fierce condemnation from critics and censors alike, and several countries including Australia and the UK maintained their bans for decades. Fulci insisted the film was a commentary on misogyny rather than an endorsement of it, but that argument was a tough sell given the graphic nature of the imagery. What is undeniable is the filmmaking craft. The cinematography captures a rotting, beautiful, terrifying city with documentary precision. The plot structure is tighter than most gialli, and the final revelation genuinely surprises. Modern genre scholars have revisited it as both a product of its era and a legitimate crime thriller buried beneath its own notoriety. The ban eventually lifted, and you can now stream the uncut version. Whether Fulci succeeded in his stated intent or created something more troubling than he realized is a debate that still rages in horror circles 40 years later. Number 3. Inferno, 1980. Dario Argento's follow-up to Suspiria is arguably the most visually stunning horror film of the 1980s, and its troubled production and censorship history only add to its mystique. Inferno is the second chapter in Argento's Three Mothers trilogy, centering on a young woman who discovers she is living in a building owned by Mater Tenebrarum, one of three ancient and powerful witches. The film was banned or heavily censored in several countries, and its U.S. theatrical release was so botched that American audiences barely knew it existed for years. This is criminal because Inferno contains sequences of such extraordinary visual beauty that they belong in art galleries. The underwater ballroom scene, shot by cinematographer Romano Albinoni with Mario Bava contributing uncredited special effects work, is one of the most breathtaking things ever filmed in the horror genre. Bava, the godfather of Italian horror himself, came out of semi-retirement to help Argento realize his vision, and his contributions are visible in the film's incredible use of colored lighting and miniature work. Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer composed the score, creating a lush, operatic soundscape that swings between haunting beauty and frantic chaos. Inferno operates on pure dream logic rather than conventional narrative structure, which frustrated mainstream audiences and critics, but enchanted horror devotees who recognized it as closer to experimental cinema than traditional genre filmmaking. Argento has stated that he considers Inferno his most personal and visually ambitious film. The critical reappraisal over the past 2 decades has been enormous, with many now ranking it alongside or even above Suspiria. Stream it, surrender to the imagery, and stop worrying about whether the plot makes sense. Number 2. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. John McNaughton made this film for roughly $110,000, and it sat unreleased for 3 years because no distributor would touch it. And the MPAA essentially told him there was no amount of cutting that would earn it anything less than an X rating. When it finally premiered, it was banned or restricted in multiple countries, and the British Board of Film Classification refused to certify it for years. Michael Rooker delivers what might be the single most chilling performance in horror history as Henry, a drifter loosely inspired by real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas. Rooker inhabits the role so completely that it reportedly affected his personal life, with people genuinely afraid to approach him after seeing the film. There is no stylization, there is no gothic atmosphere, there is no fun. McNaughton strips every ounce of entertainment value from the violence, presenting it as flat, ugly, mundane, and random. This is what horrified censors more than the gore itself. The film refuses to give the audience the safe emotional distance that traditional horror provides. Tom Towles as Otis delivers an equally unsettling performance, and the dynamic between the two characters provides a queasy examination of how violence is learned and normalized. Roger Ebert, who famously despised I Spit on Your Grave, gave Henry 3.5 stars and called it a masterpiece of its kind. That endorsement from one of the toughest mainstream critics in America speaks volumes about what McNaughton achieved. This is not a film you enjoy. It is a film that fundamentally changes how you think about violence in cinema. Stream it knowing that you are watching something that the entire film industry tried to suppress. Number 1. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Yes, the original release predates the 1980s, but Stanley Kubrick himself pulled this film from UK distribution in 1973 after receiving threats against his family, and it remained effectively banned in Britain throughout the entire decade of the 80s and well into the 90s. No other film on this list was suppressed by its own director for nearly 3 decades. You could not legally see A Clockwork Orange in the United Kingdom until after Kubrick's passing in 1999. That is an astonishing fact about one of the greatest films ever made. Malcolm McDowell's Alex DeLarge is one of cinema's most iconic and dangerous creations. A charismatic, intelligent, ultra-violent young man whose journey through crime, capture, and state-mandated behavioral conditioning raises questions about free will, governmental control, and the nature of evil that remain violently relevant today. The film sparked real-world copycat incidents that deeply disturbed Kubrick and contributed directly to his decision to suppress it. Wendy Carlos's electronic score, the meticulous production design, and McDowell's fearless performance created a cultural shockwave that governments genuinely feared. The British Parliament debated it. Newspapers campaigned against it. And Kubrick, one of the most powerful filmmakers in the world, decided that protecting his family mattered more than his art being seen. The film's influence on music, fashion, design, and filmmaking is incalculable. Punk, new wave, and electronic culture all owe it a debt. It is streaming everywhere now, fully uncut, exactly as Kubrick intended. The fact that the most banned film of the 1980s British experience was a masterpiece by cinema's greatest perfectionist tells you everything you need to know about censorship. So there you have it. 15 films that entire governments tried to stop you from watching, and now every single one of them lives on your streaming apps. Drop a comment and tell me which of these you have actually seen and which ones shocked you the most. But here is the real question I want you to fight about. Did banning these films protect anyone, or did censorship just make them more famous and more powerful than they ever would have been on their own? Tell me I am wrong. I dare you.